Hey folks, what's happening? All right, this section looks at culture, and culture essentially is, at its base explanation, learned behavior. It's ultimately the entire way of life for a group of people. It's hard for us to see our culture because we're really embedded in it and it's happening all around us. So we really never uh, consider how much culture affects the way we do things. If you think about a fish in a pond, well, the fish can see things like other fish, rocks, food, but it can't really see the water. In the same way, people walk around in society and we breathe in the air, but we really can't see it. Culture's the same way. It's all around us, but it's so ingrained into our day to day lives that we don't see it unless we stop to really look for it. Um, Culture includes things such as language, of course, standards of beauty, hand gestures, styles of dress, food, music. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's learned behavior. It's passed on from one generation to the next through communication, not through genetics. It's important to understand that culture is really passed on from one generation to the next through what we would call a communicative interaction. It's not inherited, as we mentioned earlier. For example, suppose a baby is born to a Chinese mother and a Chinese father in China. And when the baby is a week old, he or she is adopted by an American family. This happens all the time, and they move to the United States. The Chinese or the child may have Chinese features like hair color, eye shape, and other genetic characteristics, but it'll grow up speaking English. It will be an American child. It will like things that Americans like, not things that Chinese people like. Culture is learned behavior. Um, that brings us to ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism occurs when people use their own culture as a standard to evaluate another group or individual, leading to the view that cultures other than their own are abnormal. You might have experienced this yourself. If you've ever watched a program on television showing a remote tribe of people and their way of life, and that way of life seems very different than your own. And you might even say, oh, God, that's so gross. Whoa, my gosh, I can't believe that they would pierce their bodies that way, or they would put plates in their lips, or they would put rings around their necks. Um, well, when you're saying things like that, the assumption is that your culture is better than their culture. And that is a form of ethnocentrism. You're seeing their behaviors in light of your own behaviors, and you're deeming their behaviors wanting. Another thing to think about is rituals. Um, the the Nasarima have an almost pathological horror of and fascination with the mouth, the condition of which is believed to have a supernatural influence on all social relationships. Were it not for the rituals of the mouth, they believe that their teeth would fall out, their gums bleed, their jaws shrink, their friends desert them, and their lovers reject them. This is a daily body ritual which is performed by everyone who includes a mouth rite. Of course, we're talking about brushing your teeth. These are rituals that are embedded in our society, and even though we might not question where they come from, we do use them every day. Another important term to wrap your mind around, of course, is cultural relativism, which is the process of understanding other cultures on their own terms rather than judging according to one's own culture. You can think about the importance of cultural relativism when you think about studying distant or remote cultures, or even when studying different cultures within the United States. For instance, New Yorkers tend to communicate differently than people from Gatlinburg, Tennessee. If you're a researcher from New York, you have to consider these differences when you're conducting research in Gatlinburg. Now, that, of course, is a U.S. example, but you can imagine how this might play out if you're a U.S. researcher doing research on people in Nova Scotia. So when you're studying any group, it's important to try to employ cultural relativism because it helps that researcher, that sociologist, to see others more objectively, and then come to some more objective understandings of what they're finding with their research. Some components of culture. Well, you have material culture and symbolic culture, of course. Material culture includes the objects associated with a cultural group, such as tools, machines, utensils, buildings, artwork, that stuff out there that we interact with. Symbolic culture, on the other hand, includes ways of thinking, beliefs, values, assumptions, ways of behaving, things like norms, interactions, and communication. One of the most important functions of symbolic culture is to allow us to communicate through signs, gestures, and language. It allows us to string together a bunch of sounds and have somebody else make sense of them and string some back, sending a message to us. It allows for social organization and communication to become much more meaningful and much more developed and intricate. So, signs and gestures are components of culture. Signs have meanings that make sense to people who are part of that particular culture. For instance, in the United States, if you see a stop sign, you know that it means to stop driving your car, to look both ways, and then resume driving when everything is clear. You also know that a traffic signal, green means go, red means stop, yellow means caution, go slow. If you weren't part of that culture that knows that, you might not stop when you come to a stop sign, or get out of the car and leave when you encounter a stop sign. You don't have the cultural context in which the meaning is embedded. If you live in the United States and someone holds up their middle finger, you know the one, you know that they are making an expression of disapproval or of frustration. That gesture has derogatory connotations and it is intended to be insulting. In another country, the same signal could be meant as information. For example, to tell another person that their significant other may be cheating on them. So, just because you see this gesture in your own culture and you understand it, it doesn't mean it transfers to someone else's culture.